The crossroads of everything terrible. Verak Station, where you can buy anything, sell anyone, and if you're very lucky, leave with the same number of fingers you arrived with. ISV Cassian, Verak Station, Mission Day 7174. Field Log, H. Calloway and Dr. S. Vin. The waiting was the worst part. Maddox had been in enough difficult situations to know that the period between gathering intelligence and being able to act on it had a specific quality, a tightly coiled stillness that felt productive until you looked directly at it and realized it was mostly anxiety wearing a methodical coat. The Meridian and the Continuance were working on the tower transmission. Cass was working on the plant network pattern with the single-minded intensity of a Gassic who had found something genuinely interesting, which meant he had been in his quarters for 41 hours with the live cutting and had responded to 2 wellness checks with pulse transmissions that the Carlo device rendered as still working and do not interrupt the analysis respectively. The compound sample had gone to both the Meridian's lab and the Continuance's research hold, and preliminary results were expected in a week. 3 had returned to Lattice Hold Keth Vorath to submit the full mission report to the directive, which was now at day 43 and showed no signs of resolving. His parting transmission had been characteristically minimal. Report submitted. Directive in extended assessment. Will transmit on development, which Maddox had read 3 times looking for additional content and eventually concluded contained exactly as much as it said, which was the Lathian version of I'll be in touch. Voss was writing reports. This was, Maddox had come to understand, Voss's resting state, a man in continuous documentation of everything around him, which had gone from feeling like surveillance to feeling like a slightly intense form of conscientiousness. His reports were accurate and increasingly sympathetic. Maddox had stopped dreading them. Yara was running navigation models for 4 different possible next move scenarios, none of which could be confirmed, yet because they were all contingent on data that wasn't in yet. Ham was doing what Ham did when there was nothing to fix. He was finding things that weren't broken and fixing them anyway, and the Cassian's engine deck had never been in better condition, which was the engineering equivalent of pacing. And then, on day 71, the Cassian's passive comms array caught something it shouldn't have. It wasn't addressed to them. It was a tight beam transmission on a frequency the Cassian had been passively monitoring as part of the post-XRC9001 expanded sensor protocol, one of 11 frequencies that the Unnery had used in the REM-MOS data architecture. The transmission was brief, heavily compressed, and partially obscured by a moving relay signature that suggested the sender was in transit. It took Yara 40 minutes to fully reconstruct it. When she did, she brought it to Maddox without saying anything. She put the decoded text on the briefing table display and stepped back. Maddox read it. He read it again. It was a 2-part message. The first part was a set of coordinates, not for a planet they'd mapped, but for a station that was in the ISV program's secondary registry under the classification. Known Independent Commercial Hub, Use Advisory in effect. The use advisory was the program's diplomatic way of saying, this is a black market, and we know it, and we're not going to do anything about it because the intelligence value of leaving it operational exceeds the administrative cost of pretending it doesn't exist. The station was called Verak. It occupied a gravitationally stable position at the junction of 4 corridor routes, in a system with no indigenous population and no political affiliation, which was exactly the kind of position that the universe's various categories of enterprise that preferred not to be observed tended to find very convenient. The second part of the message was a time and a meeting indicator, a specific berth number at Verak Station's secondary docking ring, 7 standard days from the transmission's timestamp. The transmission's sender signature was Unnery methodology. The recipient's signature, partial, obscured, but not fully, matched a communication protocol that the Antares resistance had used in the signals that Maddox had reviewed from the Antara cell's partial data. "Someone from the Unary Initiative," Maddox said, "is meeting someone from the Antares resistance at a black market station in 4 days." "Yes," Yara said. Maddox looked at the coordinates. He looked at the meeting time. He thought about what the Unary Initiative had that the Resistance would want, and what the Resistance had that the Unary would want, and what connecting those two threads might mean for everything else they were trying to figure out. He thought about who to send. "Get me Ham and Sable," he said. Ham's response to being briefed on Verak Station was not the response Maddox had expected, which was enthusiasm about a black market's engineering supply potential. It was the response Maddox had expected, which was exactly that, followed immediately by the response Maddox should also have expected, which was a detailed and largely accurate prediction of everything that could go wrong. "A black market station," Ham said, "full of pirates, black market traders, people who sell things they shouldn't sell and buy things they shouldn't buy, and were sending me and Sable in to surveil a meeting between a rogue Lathian data collective and a resistance movement that kidnapped a Lathian and tortured him for 11 weeks. "That's an accurate summary," Maddox said. "Right," Ham said. "And your logic for sending me rather than, say, going yourself is." Sable has the best read of any non-Antares person on Antares body language and social signaling, Maddox said. "She'll be able to identify the operative and assess the meeting content from a distance. She needs a partner who can blend into a mixed-species commercial environment without drawing attention." Ham stared at him. "You think I blend in?" "I think you're the most adaptable person aboard this ship," Maddox said. "You've had drinks with pirates, hung off a Lathian hull, and navigated an alien jungle. Verak Station is a black market. You'll be fine." "That's not." "Also," Maddox said, "Verak Station is one of the most significant independent trading hubs in this corridor, and by all accounts, its engineering supply district is extraordinary." Ham stopped. He looked at the station schematic on the display. He looked at the section labeled Secondary Commercial District, Mixed Goods, No Registry Requirements. "How extraordinary," he said. "Reportedly," Maddox said, "they have parts from 17 different spacefaring civilizations, including several that aren't in the ISV database." Ham was quiet for 4 seconds. "I'm going to need a larger kit bag," he said. "You can have the equipment budget for the mission," Maddox said. "Define mission equipment." "Broadly," Maddox said. "Done," Ham said. "When do we leave?" Sable, from the doorway, said, "I'd like it noted that I was not persuaded by the engineering supply district." "Noted," Maddox said, "but you're still going." "I know," Sable said. She had the expression she wore when she was already 3 steps into planning something and was being polite about not saying so. "I'll need civilian-grade translation coverage and something to wear that doesn't look ISV. Do we have anything that doesn't look ISV?" Ham said, "I've got a jacket." "I need something for me," Sable said. "I've got 2 jackets." Ham. "I'm kidding," Ham said. "Mostly. Yara's got a kit that'll work for you. She bought it at that Soleni market and never wore it because she said it made her look festive." Sable looked at Maddox. "It'll look fine on you," Maddox said. "You're Varani. You're supposed to look festive." "That," Sable said with enormous dignity, "is a stereotype." "Is it inaccurate?" A pause. "No," she said, "but still." Verak Station announced itself from 3 light minutes out in the way that places with no interest in subtlety announce themselves, with commercial signals on every open frequency, a sprawling transmission carnival of offers and inquiries, and the specific cacophony of an economy that ran on the principle that everything had a price, and the only variable was how creative you were willing to be about establishing it. The station itself was enormous. not in the designed, purposeful way of an ISV installation or a Lathian lattice hold, in the accumulated way of something that had been built, extended, rebuilt, extended further, had entire new sections welded onto old ones without much attention to aesthetic continuity, and had eventually reached a size where coherent architecture was no longer the point and functional chaos was. It was asymmetric and lit in 17 different color temperatures, and surrounded by a docking approach that had the organized disorder of a system that had worked out, through decades of near collisions, exactly how chaotic it could afford to be. Ham, looking at it through the shuttle's forward viewport as they came in on approach, said, "That is the most beautiful, ugly thing I've ever seen." "It's a fire hazard," Sable said. "It's a fire hazard with a parts district," Ham said. "There's a difference." They docked at the civilian berth ring, paid the docking fee to an automated system that Ham noted accepted 14 different currency types and 3 categories of barter, and stepped out into Verak Station's primary concourse. The smell hit first. It was not one smell. It was an argument between competing smells, none of which were winning, all of which were present simultaneously. Food from at least a dozen different cuisines, the chemical tang of dry fuel from somewhere not adequately vented, something biological from a direction that neither of them investigated, and underneath it all the specific warm metal smell of a station that had been inhabited for a very long time by a very large number of species who all had different ideas about ventilation. Then the sound. The concourse was wide and high, and every surface reflected noise back at a slightly different angle, so the ambient din of several hundred beings going about their business had a layered, reverberant quality, conversations in a dozen languages, the automated pitch calls of market stalls, someone arguing in a species Sable didn't immediately recognize, someone else laughing in a way that sounded like a warning, and from the direction of the secondary commercial district. What might have been music, or might have been a machinery malfunction. Then the visual. The population of Verak Station's concourse was, by any standard, spectacular. 3 Orani in formal trade attire negotiating over a display case of small objects that caught light in suspicious ways. A pair of beings Ham didn't have a category for, broadly reptilian, selling something from a cart that hissed when a potential customer leaned too close. A human, scarred, practical-looking, moving through the crowd with the specific efficiency of someone who had been here long enough to have opinions about foot traffic. A cluster of what appeared to be gassic, moving in a loose formation that kept other species at a polite but meaningful distance. A being approximately the size of a ground vehicle, who was sitting against a wall eating something, and watching everyone else with the unhurried patience of a species for whom patience was a survival strategy. A vendor near the entrance was shouting at a customer in a language the Matrix caught as, "I don't care what it was rated for, it's rated for that now, and if you don't like it, you can shove it back up wherever you pulled it from." The customer responded, "You sold me a coupling that exploded, you absolute piece of." "It didn't explode, it discharged. There's a technical difference, and I'm not responsible for your inability to read a spec sheet, you." Ham had already stopped walking and was listening to this exchange with the focused attention of a man who had strong opinions about couplings. "Ham," Sable said. "The vendor's right," Ham said. "There is a technical." "Ham," Sable said. "Meeting, berth 7, secondary docking ring, that's the objective." "Aye," Ham said. "Right." Objective. He looked at the vendor's stall display with the expression of a man making a very difficult choice. "Can we just?" "After," Sable said. "If we survive the espionage portion of the day, you may look at whatever you like." "That's the most reasonable thing anyone said to me on this mission," Ham said, and followed her. The secondary docking ring was on the station's outer tier, accessible via a transit tube that smelled of old fuel and newer grease, and stopped at 7 different levels, each of which offered its own specific category of commerce. Level 3 was where the meeting berth was located, and Level 3 had the quality of a place that had decided informality was a business model. Low-ceilinged, warmly lit in the amber range that suggested someone had read that warm lighting made people less inclined to check credentials, and lined with small establishments that served things in containers without labeling them. "Right," Ham said, looking at it. "This is the part where I get stabbed." "Nobody is going to stab you," Sable said. "That vendor on level 1 absolutely wanted to stab me." "You told him his coupling specs were incorrect." "They were incorrect. In front of his customer." Ham paused. In retrospect that was. "Berth 7 is at the end of the corridor," Sable said. "From what I can see, there are 2 establishments with sight lanes to the berth entrance. The one on the left serves food, the one on the right serves drinks. We split up. I take the food establishment, closer angle on the berth, better visibility. You take the bar." Ham looked at her. "You're sending me to the bar." "I'm assigning you to the observation position with the drinks," Sable said. "Drink slowly. Watch the berth entrance. Note who goes in. If the meeting breaks up and they leave separately, you follow the unary contact. I'll follow the antaresar. And if something goes wrong." "Comms are open," Sable said. "Say engineering emergency, and I'll come to you." "Why engineering emergency?" "Because on a station full of pirates and smugglers, an engineering emergency is the most believable crisis a Scottish man could plausibly have." Ham looked at her for a moment. "I'm going to choose to take that as a compliment." "It was 1, Sable said. "Go, the meeting's in 40 minutes. He went. The food establishment on the left side of level 3 was called, according to the sign above its entrance, something in a script the translation matrix rendered as honest portions. This was either a sincere statement of the proprietor's values or the funniest irony Sable had encountered on the station, and after 5 minutes inside she concluded it was probably both. The portions were, in fact, large. The honesty of their composition was less certain. She took a corner table with a clear sightline to berth 7's entrance and ordered whatever the proprietor pointed at when she indicated she was flexible, which turned out to be a bowl of something hot and orange that smelled of salt and something floral, and was, after the first cautious spoonful, genuinely good. She filed this under, unexpected, and settled in to watch. The Antaresar operative arrived first, which told her something. You arrived first to a meeting on a station like this when you wanted the high ground, when you wanted to be seated and assessing when the other party walked in. She almost missed them initially because they weren't presenting as Antaresar. The distinctive violet eyes were covered by tinted eyewear. The posture was deliberately casual. The clothing was the layered, nondescript style of a dozen different species. But the bioluminescence was absent in a way that read as deliberate suppression. The same controlled stillness she had seen in the resistance operative on Solen. And the Antaresar's restrained expressiveness, the careful economy of their face even at rest, was distinctive once you knew what to look for. They went into berth 7's attached meeting room, a small, glass-paneled space that was ostensibly used for cargo negotiations, and which had, Sable noted, a privacy screen that activated from the inside. The screen activated 30 seconds after the operative entered. 12 minutes later, the unary contact arrived. Sable had been trying to work out what an unary operative looked like. The answer, it turned out, was a human woman, mid-40s, dressed in the practical working clothes of someone who spent time in space, with a specific kind of moving through crowds efficiency that came from years of operating in places where being noticed was expensive. She walked into berth 7's meeting room. The privacy screen stayed active, and Sable noted the time. She ate her orange food. She waited. In her earpiece, Ham was quiet, which was either professional discipline or something had distracted him, and she had made peace with not knowing which. 23 minutes later, the privacy screen dropped. They came out together, but not close. The operative first, the unary human 3 steps behind. Enough distance to be deniable, but enough body language to communicate that the meeting had concluded on whatever terms they'd agreed. The operative left level 3 via the transit tube. The unary contact stopped at the corridor entrance, looked in both directions once with a practiced scan of someone checking for observation, and then went right toward the station's outer commercial ring. Sable paid for her orange food and followed the Antarisar operative. She caught up with them on level 2, at a transit junction where the crowd thinned enough that following at close range became inadvisable. She kept 3 bodies between herself and the operative and let the Varani talent for reading physical environment, developed across centuries of trade negotiations, where reading the room was often more important than reading the contract, do the work. The operative was not moving toward the docking ring. They were moving toward the station's communication center, which was a cluster of private transmission booths on level 2's central hub that anyone could rent by the minute, and which had, according to the station's own promotional material, a policy of complete signal confidentiality. This was either true or it wasn't, but the policy's existence told you something about what the communication center's clientele needed. The operative entered a booth. Sable entered the adjacent one, close enough that the signal bleed from an unsecured transmission would be readable by the sensor array she'd been carrying in her left jacket pocket since they'd left the Cassian, which was a piece of equipment that Yara had quietly pressed into her hand at the docking bay with the words, "If they use a standard compression protocol, this will catch it. Good luck." The transmission lasted 4 minutes. The sensor array caught it. Sable stayed in her booth for an extra 2 minutes after the operative left, running a preliminary decode on what the array had captured. The compression protocol was not fully standard. It was resistance modified, a variant she'd seen references to in the partial data from the Solen facility. But it wasn't fully obscured, and the array was designed for this, and what came through in the 2-minute decode was enough. Enough to tell her what the meeting had been about. Enough to make her very still in a booth on level 2 of Verak Station, eating the last of the candied Soleni fruit she'd brought in her pocket, and think about what she needed to say to Maddox. Her earpiece activated, Ham's voice at a volume that suggested the surrounding environment had become complicated. Sable, engineering emergency. She put away the array and went to find him. The bar where Ham had taken his observation post was called, according to the sign, the neutral stance, which was either a philosophical statement or a description of the furniture, and Ham had been in it for 40 minutes when the wine debate started. It hadn't been his fault, or rather, it had been exactly his fault, but in the way that things were his fault when they were technically the result of his own choices, but those choices were entirely reasonable given the available information. He had been watching Berth 7's entrance with professional discipline for approximately the first 12 minutes. Then the person next to him at the bar had started a conversation with the bartender about the relative merits of 2 bottles on the top shelf, and Ham, who had listened to this conversation for 3 minutes before realizing he had opinions about it, had made the mistake of sharing them. The person next to him was a Muvari. The Muvari were, Ham knew from the Cassian species briefing, warm-feathered, broadly avian in some aspects of their morphology, and culturally passionate about fermented beverages to a degree that made the Varani's enthusiasm for Garanian wine look like mild interest. Ham had not, in reviewing the species briefing, paid adequate attention to the section that noted, "Approach Muvari wine discussion with diplomatic caution, as strong disagreement can be interpreted as a personal challenge." Ham had not been diplomatic. Ham had been correct. These were, in his experience, the same thing. "What I'm saying," Ham said, to the Muvari, who was now 3 inches closer than it had been a minute ago, its feathers doing something that the translation matrix was categorizing as elevated engagement, is that the fermentation vessel matters as much as the base crop. If you're using a container that's porous at the molecular level, you get contamination from the ambient material and the profile shifts. It doesn't matter how good your Soleni pressed fruit is if you're aging it in a tank that was previously used for drive coolant. The Muvari said something that the matrix rendered as, "That is the most ignorant thing I have heard from a being without feathers, and I have heard many ignorant things from beings without feathers. I'm not saying it's your fault, Ham said. I'm saying the vessel. The vessel I use, the Muvari said. Its feathers now doing something the Matrix described as very elevated engagement with hostile undertone, has been in my family for 9 generations and has produced wine that has. 9 generations of contamination is still contamination, Ham said. You just get used to it. I'm not criticizing the wine, I'm criticizing the chemistry. The Muvari stood up. It was taller than Ham had realized, which was information that arrived at a moment when it was no longer actionable. You, the Muvari said, with the elaborate precision of someone choosing their words very carefully so they could not later be misquoted, are an insult to fermentation. That doesn't make sense, Ham said. I can't be an insult to. The Muvari threw its drink at him. Ham, who had excellent reflexes when they were relevant, ducked. The drink went over his head and hit a being on the other side of the bar who had not been involved in the conversation and who had, up to this point, been having a perfectly adequate evening. This being turned around. It was large, green-grey, and had the expression of something that found the current development both surprising and personally offensive. That was my fault, Ham said immediately to the large green-grey being. Not directly, but causally, I apologize. The large green-grey being did not appear to be in an accepting apologies mood. What happened next occupied approximately 4 minutes and involved Ham's bar stool, a second Muvari who had apparently arrived in support of the first, the large green-grey being, and 2 humans who hadn't been part of the original conversation, but who seemed to have decided, on general principles, to pick a side. Ham was not entirely sure whose side they were on, which was fine because the sides were not clearly defined. He was doing reasonably well, all things considered. He had not been hit yet. The bar stool had proven useful as a distance management tool, and he had landed on his feet after the second Muvari's attempt at a shoulder charge, when Sable arrived. She walked into the bar with the composed, unhurried manner of someone who had not just crossed 2 levels of a black market station at speed, and who had absolutely not been slightly worried. She assessed the situation in approximately 1 second. She said nothing. She walked to the bar's proprietor, a being of indeterminate species, behind the counter, who was watching events with the expression of someone calculating the repair bill, and placed a currency chip on the surface. For the drinks, she said, and whatever the furniture costs. The proprietor looked at the chip, looked at Sable, looked at the ongoing situation. And for the trouble, Sable said, and placed a second chip. The proprietor put 2 fingers in their mouth and produced a sound that cut through the bar noise with the authority of a sound that had been doing exactly this for many years. Everything stopped. In the silence, Sable said pleasantly, "My colleague has a very early shuttle to catch. We're leaving now. Thank you all for a lovely evening." She picked up Ham's kit bag, which had been under his stool and was miraculously undamaged, and walked toward the door. Ham followed, with the dignity of a man who had technically won the bar stool portion of the evening and was choosing to exit gracefully rather than press the advantage. In the corridor outside, Sable handed him his kit bag. "Engineering emergency," she said. "The wine debate was a matter of principle," Ham said. "Did you watch the birth?" "For the first 12 minutes," Ham said. "Then it got complicated. Did you get what we came for?" "Yes," Sable said. "Then we're net positive," Ham said. Sable looked at him. "You have a Muvari feather in your hair." Ham reached up and removed it. He looked at it for a moment. "Do you think they'd take it back?" "I think we should leave the station," Sable said. "Aye," Ham said. "Fair." He took 4 steps toward the transit tube, stopped, turned, and looked back at the commercial corridor they passed through on the way in. At the engineering supply stalls, their displays lit in a dozen colors. At the parts, unconventional, unregistered, made by hands he'd never know from materials he didn't have names for yet. 2 minutes, he said. Ham. I've got a kit bag, Ham said. I've got a mission equipment budget. I saw a flux coupling variant on level 1 that I have never seen before in my life, and I'm not leaving this station without understanding what it does. 2 minutes. Sable looked at the ceiling of Verak Station's level 3 corridor, which was covered in years of accumulated signage from a dozen civilizations, and had at least 3 cables running across it that had no obvious purpose. 5 minutes, she said, and you tell me what everything is while you look at it so I can put it in the mission log. Ham's face achieved a state of such profound satisfaction that it was briefly beautiful. Deal, he said, and moved. They were back on the shuttle 40 minutes later, which was 35 minutes after the agreed 5 minutes, and Ham had a kit bag that was noticeably heavier than when he'd arrived. Sable had the sensor array data, the decoded partial transmission, and the Muvari feather, which Ham had asked her to keep because he'd decided he might put it somewhere on the engine deck as a trophy, and she'd held on to it on the grounds that it was evidence of the evening's events and should therefore be properly documented. The flight back to the Cassian was quiet. Sable was organizing what she'd gathered into a coherent sequence. Ham was cataloguing his acquisitions with the specific joy of a man who has found something he didn't know he needed and now cannot imagine being without it. He held up a small, irregular component, dark gray, slightly luminescent at one edge, made from a material that the Cassian's database had flagged as composition partially consistent with XRC900, 1 compound derivatives. Ham stared at it. Sable, he said. Yes. He showed her the component. He showed her the database flag on his handheld scanner. Sable looked at it for a long moment. Where did you buy that? She said. Stall on level 1, Ham said. The vendor said it came off a salvage haul from the outer corridor. Said he didn't know what it was, just that it conducted like nothing he'd seen before. I bought it because it conducted like nothing I'd seen before. It's made from the compound, Sable said, or something derived from it. Someone processed XRC9001, Ham said. Refined it into a component, sold it through salvage channels to a black market vendor who had no idea what it was. The crates, Sable said, the ones in the cavern, packed and ready for shipment. Aye, Ham said. He looked at the component in his hand. Cap's going to want to see this. Cap's going to want to see everything, Sable said. Maddox listened to all of it. This was one of his qualities that Sable had noted in the early days of the mission and had come to rely on absolutely. He did not interrupt, did not redirect, did not start drawing conclusions before the data was complete. He listened in the specific way that good captains listened, which was with the whole of his attention and none of his conclusions, and he waited until Sable and Ham had both finished before he said anything at all. Then he sat back and looked at the table. The meeting, he said. The Antaresar operative, what were they exchanging? The Unary had data, Sable said. I couldn't get the full content of the meeting, the privacy screen blocked direct observation. But the transmission the operative sent afterward, what I caught from the array, was a summary. She paused. The Unary gave the resistance information about XRC9001, specifically about the tower, specifically about the tower's transmission. They knew about the tower, Maddox said. They knew about the tower before we did, Sable said. Or at the same time. The data they handed to the Antaresar operative included a partial decode of the transmission signal. Not the same decode we're working on, different methodology, different fragments, but overlapping. The Unary had already been working on the signal, Maddox said. For some time, I think, Sable said. The partial decode in the data they passed, it was structured. Someone had been building that decode for a while. Maddox was quiet. The Unary Initiative, he said. Former Lathian assets, they had the coordinates, they had stolen Lathian data. And they've been working on XRC9001 independently. decoding the tower signal, and now they're sharing what they found with the Antaresar resistance. What does the resistance want with the tower signal? Yara said. I don't know yet, Sable said. The transmission summary was partial, but she paused. The Antaresar operative's response at the end of the meeting, the body language, I could read it from the food establishment. She looked at Maddox. They were frightened. Of the signal. Of what the signal means, Sable said. Whatever partial decode the Unnery gave them, it was enough to frighten an Antaresar resistance operative who has been running an underground network for years under Lathian occupation without apparent fear. She paused. That's a significant threshold to cross. The briefing room was quiet. Ham put the component on the table, the one from Verak Station with its faint luminescence. Found this at a salvage stall, he said. Partial XRC9001 composition, processed, refined into a functional component, already in the supply chain at a black market station. Maddox looked at it. He looked at Sable. He looked at Yara. The crates are already moving, he said. Whatever was being extracted and stockpiled, it's not just being stored. It's being distributed, processed into components and fed into the galaxy's supply chain through channels that don't ask where things come from. How long has this been going on? Yara said. That vendor on level 1 had no idea what he was selling, Ham said. Someone above him in the chain didn't tell him. Someone above them didn't tell anyone below them. It's been seeded into the supply chain at enough distance from the source that tracing it back is. Hard, Maddox said. Deliberately hard. Aye. Maddox looked at the component for a long moment. He thought about centuries of operation, about patient, quiet extraction, about the tower deciding to reveal itself, about crates packed for shipment and components already circulating in a supply chain that touched every spacefaring civilization in the corridor. He was about to say something when the comms console activated. Not a standard channel, not ISV, not Lathian relay, not any registered frequency. A frequency that matched one entry in the Cassian's expanded monitoring protocol, one of the frequencies used by the REM MAW. The message was 3 words and a punctuation mark. Maddox read it. He read it again. He looked at the display for a moment with an expression that cycled through several things and arrived at something that was partly exasperated and partly, if he was honest, impressed. He turned the display so the rest of the room could see it. It read, "You're welcome, you owe me one. Vex." Ham stared at it. Sable stared at it. Yara stared at it. Vex, Ham said. The pirate, the one who shot at us. The one with too many teeth, Maddox said. He arranged the intercept, Sable said slowly. The Unnery transmission. He let us catch it. He wanted us at that meeting, Maddox said. Why? Yara said. Maddox looked at the message again. At the REM MAW's frequency. At the 3 words and the punctuation mark and the signed name of a pirate captain with iridescent chitinous plates and a grin full of too many teeth who had once tried to rob them and had, on reflection, apparently decided there were more interesting things to do with the relationship. Because, Maddox said, Vex knows something about what's being distributed. He operates in that supply chain. He's been watching XRC9001 from the outside for longer than we have, probably. And whatever the Unnery told the Antaresar that frightened them. He paused. Vex already knew, he said, and he decided we needed to know too. And he didn't want to be the one to tell us directly. The briefing room was very quiet. That's either very generous of him, Ham said, or very self-serving. Both, Maddox said. Almost certainly both, which means whatever is coming, whatever the tower's transmission is calling toward, whatever the compound is being distributed for, whatever is at the other end of those crates' delivery route. He looked at the component on the table, at its faint luminescence. It's big enough, he said, that even a pirate with too many teeth decided he didn't want to be on the wrong side of it alone. He looked at Vas, who had been silent in the corner since Ham and Sable had come back, and had listened to everything with the careful stillness of a man who was writing the most significant report of his career in his head, and was very focused on getting it right. Vas, Maddox said. I know, Vas said. I'm already writing it. Tell Command we need to talk to Vex, Maddox said, and tell them about the component, and tell them, he paused, tell them we think the supply chain has been seeded, tell them it might already be everywhere. Vas looked at him. He looked at the component on the table. Yes, Vas said. I'll tell them. He did not look like a man who was pleased about being the one to say it. Maddox pulled up the Cassian's navigation display and looked at the corridor, at XRC9001, and its transmitting tower, at the Resistance's underground network, at the Lathium directive still running past all historical records, at Verak Station, somewhere behind them with its noise and its commerce and its unknowing supply chain selling components that glowed faintly in the dark. He opened a return channel on the REM-Mars frequency. He typed 4 words. He sent them. The message read, "What do you know?" He waited. Personal log, Captain R. Maddox, ISV Cassian, post Verak Station. Ham bought a component from a salvage stall that is partially composed of XRC9001. It was already in the supply chain. It had already passed through enough hands that the vendor had no idea what it was. We don't know how many of them there are. We don't know who made them or where they're going. We don't know whether the people buying them know what they have. The Antaresar resistance met with Unary operatives and came away frightened. Sable is not a person who uses that word casually. She said, frightened. I'm taking that seriously. Vex tipped us off. The pirate captain who shot at us tried to rob us and left on terms that I would describe as mutually bewildered. Has apparently decided that whatever is moving through this corridor is something he'd rather have us know about. This is either the most cynical, self-interested gesture I've encountered, or the most pragmatic form of alliance building I've seen from someone operating outside any official framework. I've sent him 4 words. I'm waiting. The directive is at day 47. 3 hasn't transmitted since submitting the XRC9001 report. The Meridian and the Continuance are working. Cass is working. Yara is modeling scenarios that keep producing outcomes she doesn't like. I have a component on my briefing table that glows faintly in the dark, made from a mineral that generates spatial anomalies and weapons that can destroy Lathian dreadnoughts, already circulating in a supply chain that runs through every major hub in this corridor. I don't know what's at the other end of the tower's transmission. I don't know whose hands those crates are going to. I don't know what frightened the resistance enough to make them reach out to a rogue former Lathian collective for data. I know that something has been very patient for a very long time, and that patience has recently given way to something else. And I know that when patience gives way, what comes next is usually the thing the patience was for. Ham is in the engine room showing the components he bought to 6 over a video link with 3's permission. I can hear him explaining each one. 6 is asking questions. 3 has not told Ham to stop, which I am choosing to interpret as endorsement. We're going to need all of them in whatever is coming. Maddox,